Ethan Mercer straightened his tie in the mirror and smiled at his own reflection. The smile of a man who had already decided that the woman waiting for him at the altar was not the one he wanted. He had made that decision 6 weeks ago. He just hadn't told Charlotte yet. That's the kind of man he was. If you've ever given everything you had to someone who treated your sacrifice like a convenience store, open when they needed something, invisible the rest of the time, then you already know exactly how this story ends before it begins. And if you haven't, stay close. Because what Charlotte Ashford walked into on that Saturday afternoon in May will make you question every quiet sacrifice you've ever made for someone who never deserved it. Drop a like if this already has your blood pressure rising. And tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what happens next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about loyalty, power, and the kind of love that doesn't ask you to shrink. The morning of the wedding, Charlotte Ashford ironed her bridesmaid dress with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything in her life. Methodical, careful. Not because she enjoyed the task, but because someone had to do it, and that someone had always been her. She pressed the iron along the neckline and didn't think about the fact that she had ironed Ethan's shirts for 4 years. She didn't think about the night she had stayed up until 2 in the morning restructuring his pitch decks, line by line, so his investors wouldn't see the gaps in his logic. She didn't think about the loan she had taken out against her own savings account to cover his business losses when he was too proud to ask his family for money and too reckless to stop spending. She thought about the seating chart instead. She had designed that too. Charlotte was 34 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years being the most useful person in Ethan Mercer's life. She had introduced him to Richard Hale, the venture capitalist who had eventually funded Ethan's company. She had proofread every contract. She had smoothed over every professional relationship he had bruised with his carelessness. She had done all of this not because she was weak, but because she loved him, and because she was good at fixing things, and because she had somehow convinced herself that her value in his life was proportional to how much she could carry. That was the mistake she would spend the next 2 years trying to understand. She hung the dress on the back of the bathroom door and stood in front of the mirror for a long moment. Her face looked the same as it always did. Dark eyes, sharp jaw, the kind of face that people described as striking rather than beautiful, which she had stopped taking as a compliment years ago. There was a tension around her mouth she couldn't quite release. She told herself it was nerves, normal wedding nerves. She was the maid of honor, after all. There was a lot to manage. She told herself that 3 more times before she stopped believing it. The Whitmore estate sat on 12 acres of manicured grounds north of the city, the kind of place that made wealth feel like a moral achievement rather than an accident of inheritance. Charlotte arrived early, as she always did, and spent the first hour managing florists, redirecting confused caterers, and locating the missing ring bearer who had wandered into the garden maze and required a small rescue operation. By the time she had finished, her heels had sunk twice into the soft ground, and there was a grass stain on her left ankle she hadn't noticed yet. Madeline Sterling arrived 90 minutes late. She came in through the main entrance in a cloud of expensive perfume and borrowed confidence, 4 assistants trailing behind her, and she looked extraordinary. Charlotte's cousin had always looked extraordinary. She was the kind of woman who understood presentation as a form of power, every piece of her constructed and deliberate, from the curve of her upswept hair to the particular shade of champagne in her dress. She swept into the room and immediately found Charlotte and smiled the smile that had always made Charlotte feel like she was being assessed rather than greeted. "You look exhausted," Madeline said, and kissed the air beside Charlotte's cheek. "I've been here since 8, Charlotte said. "I know." Madeline's smile didn't change. "You're so good at this stuff." Charlotte looked at her cousin for a long moment. She couldn't name what she was feeling. It wasn't quite suspicion, and it wasn't quite dread. It was something thinner than either of those things. A hairline fracture in a wall she had been carefully maintaining for months without fully understanding why. "The flowers look beautiful," Charlotte said instead, and went back to work. She didn't see Ethan until an hour before the ceremony. He was standing in the corridor outside the groom's suite with his best man Patrick and 2 of his college friends. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand even though it was barely noon, and when Charlotte walked toward him, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that moved through his eyes and was gone before she could identify it. "Hey," he said. Hey. She stopped in front of him. You ready? Course. He took a drink. Everything running on time? Yes, the officiant is already here. The flowers are set. The caterers know the schedule. She paused. You okay? Fine. He said it too fast. His eyes moved away from her face to a point somewhere over her shoulder. Charlotte stood there another beat, waiting for something she couldn't name. He didn't offer it. She nodded once, smoothed her expression into something professional and unreadable, and went back to managing his wedding. The ceremony was beautiful. Of course it was. Charlotte had planned it. She stood at the front of the room with the other bridesmaids 3 feet from the altar and watched Ethan's face as Madeline walked down the aisle. And that was where it happened. That was the moment the hairline fracture became something structural, something that could not be repaired. Because the expression on Ethan Mercer's face when he looked at Madeline Sterling was the expression of a man who had already won something he had wanted for a very long time. Not wonder, not nerves, satisfaction. Charlotte had never once seen him look at her that way. She kept her face still. She was good at that. She had been good at that for years. She stood straight and she breathed evenly, and she did not move when the vows were exchanged, even though something inside her chest was coming apart with a quietness that was somehow worse than noise. It was during the reception that she understood the full dimensions of what had happened. She was standing near the bar, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, when she overheard Patricia Marsh and one of Madeline's friends, a woman with a voice like a foghorn and no particular interest in discretion, speaking to someone in the alcove behind her. I still can't believe she didn't figure it out sooner, Patricia said. She was busy planning their wedding, the other woman said, and laughed. Ethan's been gone on Madeline since the Hale Group dinner. You know that. That was 8 months ago. And Charlotte just kept, God, she's like a golden retriever. You throw her a task and she fetches it. Charlotte's hand tightened around the glass. He was smart about it, though, Patricia continued. Wait until after she gets him the meeting with Richard Hale. Wait until the funding is secured. Wait until the company is actually viable. Then, she made a sound like a door closing. Trade up. The glass in Charlotte's hand was very cold. Does she know? The second woman asked. She's about to, Patricia said, and from her tone she was already looking forward to it. Charlotte set the glass down on the bar with a precise, controlled motion. She turned around. Patricia Marsh was standing 10 feet away with a flute of champagne, and when her eyes met Charlotte's, they widened just slightly. The particular widening of someone who has said something they didn't intend to be overheard and is now recalibrating. Charlotte looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she walked away. She found a quiet corridor off the main ballroom and stood with her back against the wall and breathed. She pressed her palms flat against the cool plaster, and she breathed. That was all she was capable of doing for about 45 seconds. Just breathing, keeping herself from breaking apart in a hallway while a DJ played something upbeat 40 feet away, and someone laughed loud enough to be heard over the music. 8 months. She had introduced Ethan to Richard Hale 9 months ago. She ran the math without wanting to. The timeline assembled itself in her mind with the particular cruelty of things that suddenly make too much sense. The changes in Ethan over the past year, the growing distance, the increasing irritability, the way he had started making decisions without consulting her. She had attributed it to the pressure of the funding rounds, the stress of building the company. She had given him more space. She had worked harder. She had taken on more of his load so he wouldn't feel overwhelmed. She had been the most useful person in his life, right up until the moment he didn't need her to be. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A text from an unknown number. Charlotte, come to the front entrance. There's something you need to understand about tonight. She stared at the message for a long moment. Unknown number. No further context. The rational response was to ignore it entirely. She walked to the front entrance. The night air outside the estate hit her like a cold hand pressed against a fever. She stood at the top of the stone steps and looked out at the dark driveway, the line of luxury cars, the hired valets moving with professional briskness. She had no idea what she was looking for. You planned every detail of tonight. The voice came from her left. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the light from the entrance, slightly removed from it, The way a man stands when he is accustomed to choosing exactly how much of himself to make visible. Dark suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open one button. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that had been handsome for a long time and still was, though it had the quality of something that had lived through weather. His eyes were the particular dark that makes it difficult to tell what someone is thinking, not because they hide feeling, but because they contain too much of it to be read easily. She had never seen him before in her life, and yet something in the quality of his stillness made her feel like he had been standing in her peripheral vision for years. "Who are you?" she said. "Damien Moretti." He said it the way people state facts about geography, not an introduction, a coordinate. The name registered. She had heard it in passing, in the particular way that powerful names circulate in financial circles. Never directly, always lateral. Damien Moretti. Legitimate business holdings across 6 states. The kind of man whose presence at a dinner changed how other men sat in their chairs. And the other things that circulated more quietly in other circles, which she was not going to think about right now. "You sent me that text," she said. "Yes?" "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not pity, not curiosity, not the particular sympathy people give you when they've watched you be publicly humiliated and feel vaguely relieved it wasn't them. Something more considered than any of those things. "4 years ago," he said, "you were brought in as a third-party consultant on a transaction involving one of my subsidiary holdings, Kellerman Financial Group. Do you remember it?" Charlotte went still. "The restructuring audit." "You found something," Damien said. She remembered. She had been 30, relatively new in her career, and she had been handed what should have been a routine audit. 3 weeks in, buried in the fourth quarter reconciliations, she had found a pattern of internal transfers that didn't reconcile, small enough amounts individually to escape casual review, large enough in aggregate to represent a significant fraud. She had flagged it. She had been told by her supervising partner to write it up as a footnote and move on, that the client relationship was sensitive, that discretion was expected. She had submitted a full fraud report instead. She had lost that consulting contract within the week. Her supervising partner had been furious. She had told herself she'd done the right thing. She had tried to believe that for a long time. "The fraud report you filed was suppressed," Damien said. "My people didn't receive it through official channels, but I received a copy through other means. It was thorough, it was accurate, and the 3 executives responsible were removed within 90 days. Charlotte looked at him. "You're telling me you knew about that?" "I've known about it for 4 years. "And you never—" She stopped. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," Damien said, and his voice carried the weight of something specific. "Approximately 18 months after you filed that report, I reached out through an intermediary and extended a professional courtesy, an open offer. In exchange for what you'd done, I offered to provide assistance, of whatever kind you required, at a time of your choosing." Charlotte's memory snagged on something. A letter. She had received a letter through her firm, formal and brief, from a holding company she hadn't recognized. A professional offer of unspecified assistance. She had assumed it was a business solicitation of some kind, slightly strange in its vagueness. She had responded politely. She had asked what form the assistance might take. The response had come back. "Any form you require." She had thought about that for 2 days. Then she had written back. "I used it," she said slowly, "to arrange an introduction. You asked me to facilitate an introduction between a Mercer and Richard Hale." Charlotte's eyes closed for 1 second. 1 second. Then she opened them. Ethan had been struggling. His company needed capital, and he couldn't get the right meeting. She had exhausted her own contacts. And then she had remembered the letter, the open offer, the holding company she'd never identified. She had thought, this is what it's for. She had used the favor. For Ethan. For the man who was, at this moment, dancing with her cousin inside the building behind her. "The favor I offered you," Damien said, was yours to use as you chose. I don't assign value to how it was spent." "But you know," Charlotte said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. "I know what happened between then and now." He paused. "I've watched your work. The Kellerman report wasn't an accident. The way you think, the way you identify what others overlook, it's not common." She looked at him. Her chest was doing something complicated. She didn't have language for it yet. "Why are you here tonight?" "Because I thought you should know that what was taken from you wasn't small." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, withdrew a card, held it out. It was black, the kind of matte black that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. His name was on it, nothing else. No title, no company name, just a number beneath it. Charlotte looked at the card for a long moment. She didn't take it immediately. "What is this?" she said. "An invitation to build something of your own." He held the card with 2 fingers, steady, not pressing it toward her, just making it available. "Not a favor this time. Employment. Legitimate. Earned." She took the card. It was heavier than it should have been for its size. "You don't know me," she said. "I've read your work for 4 years." Reading someone's work and knowing them are different things. "Yes," he said simply. "They are." She looked at him. He looked back. He had the quality, rare, she would later think, genuinely rare in men with that kind of power, of not filling silence with reassurance. He didn't tell her she could trust him. He didn't tell her she had nothing to lose. He just stood there, present and still, and let her think. Inside the building behind her, the music changed to something slow. She thought about the timeline. 8 months. She thought about the contracts she had proofread, and the pitch decks she had rebuilt, and the loan she had taken against her savings account. She thought about standing at that altar watching Ethan's face when he looked at Madeline. She thought about Patricia Marsh's voice. She's like a golden retriever. You throw her a task and she fetches it. She looked down at the card in her hand. It was warm now, from her grip. "I need time," she said. "Take it," Damien said. She looked up. He was already turning to leave. "Mr. Moretti." She didn't know why she said it. He stopped. She said, "Why tonight? You could have reached out any time in the last 4 years. Why wait until—" She gestured vaguely at the building, at all of it. He turned back to look at her, just once, and in the light from the entrance, she saw something move through his expression, briefly, carefully, before it settled back into stillness. "Because tonight," he said, "was the first night you weren't building someone else's future." He walked to a dark car idling at the edge of the drive. The door opened. He got in. The car moved away with the particular quiet of very expensive engineering, and then the driveway was empty and Charlotte was standing alone at the top of the stone steps with a black card in her hand and the distant sound of someone else's wedding music in her ears. She stood there for a long time. The grass stain was still on her ankle. Her heels had sunk into the soft ground again without her noticing. Inside, someone was giving a toast. She could hear the rise of laughter, the tap of glasses. Ethan's name, said warmly, said with affection, said by people who knew the version of him he had constructed from the materials she had handed him. Charlotte Ashford looked at the black card. Then she put it in her dress pocket, pressed her palm flat against it for a moment, and went back inside to finish doing her job. She managed the rest of the evening the way she managed everything, precisely, quietly, without complaint. She directed the caterers through the dessert course. She coordinated the photographer for the formal exit. She handed Madeline her bouquet for the toss with a steady hand and a controlled expression. She did not cry. Not then. She saved that for the drive home, alone in her car, parked in the dark outside her apartment building, where no one could see it and no one would later be able to say they had witnessed her break. She cried for about 20 minutes. Then she stopped because she was practical and because she had learned a long time ago that grief had a budget, and spending all of it at once left you with nothing for the weeks ahead. She sat in the dark and turned the black card over in her hand, both sides smooth, just his name and the number. No title, no company, no explanation of what he was offering beyond the word she was holding in her mind like something too fragile to set down, legitimate. She thought about the Kellerman report. She thought about the 3 executives who had been removed. She thought about the fact that a man she had never met had tracked the downstream consequences of a decision she had made at 30 years old, when she was relatively unknown and professionally vulnerable and had done the right thing anyway, not for credit, not for reward, just because the fraud was real and the people being harmed by it were real, and she couldn't write it as a footnote and pretend she hadn't seen it. She thought, he noticed that. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She wasn't sure she trusted it. She wasn't sure she trusted anything tonight, including her own judgment, which had, it was important to be honest about this, been catastrophically wrong about Ethan for somewhere between 8 months and 4 years, depending on when you wanted to start the clock. But she kept the card. She turned her key in the ignition and drove home and went inside and sat at her kitchen table for another hour in the quiet of her apartment, the black card on the table in front of her, and she thought about what Damien Moretti had said. This time, build your own future. Not, I'll help you. Not, you deserve better. Not, let me take care of this for you. Build your own future. She put the card in the drawer of her desk, in the back, under a folder of tax documents where she would have to make a deliberate decision to retrieve it. She was not impulsive. She was not going to call a number on a black card because a man with quiet eyes had said something resonant on a bad night. She made tea. She drank it. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time, but when she finally did, just before 4 in the morning, her hand was curled loosely at her side, and in the space between waking and sleep, she was not thinking about Ethan Mercer at all. 6 days after the wedding, Charlotte retrieved the card from under the tax documents. She didn't do it impulsively. She did it the way she made every significant decision. She waited until the initial noise inside her head had quieted enough for her to hear what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was this. She had $4,700 in her checking account, a consulting practice that had been quietly bleeding clients for the past year because she had been too consumed with Ethan's problems to pursue her own, and a professional reputation that was solid but stalled, the reputation of someone who did excellent work inside other people's structures and had never yet built one of her own. She was 34 years old. She called the number. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice, professional and precise. Moretti Group. How can I direct your call? Charlotte hadn't expected a switchboard. She said her name. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then, Ms. Ashford, Mr. Moretti is available Thursday at 2 o'clock. Will that work for you? Thursday was 2 days away. She said yes. She spent those 2 days doing what she did when she was nervous and didn't want to admit it. She prepared. She pulled everything she could find on the Moretti Group's public holdings. 6 legitimate corporations across financial services, real estate development, and logistics. She found 3 annual reports, 2 profiles in regional business publications, and a profile of Damien Moretti himself in a Chicago magazine from 4 years ago that told her mostly what she already expected: private, measured, philanthropically active in ways that suggested strategy rather than sentiment, the kind of wealth that had passed the point where it needed to advertise itself. She also found the other things, the quieter things, not in publications, in the particular way that information moves through financial circles when nobody wants to be the one saying it directly. The name Moretti connected to neighborhoods that had changed character over 15 years, to certain city council decisions that had gone in unexpected directions, to a federal investigation in 2019 that had been quietly closed without charges. She sat with that for a full evening. Then she thought about the Kellerman report. She thought about what he'd said. Legitimate. Earned. She went on Thursday. The Moretti Group's offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Michigan Avenue that was handsome without being ostentatious, the architectural equivalent of a man who owned an excellent watch and never mentioned it. The lobby was marble and understated lighting, and a receptionist who greeted Charlotte by name before she had introduced herself. She was taken to a conference room on the 31st floor with a view of the lake that was, objectively, extraordinary. She stood at the window for a moment before she caught herself doing it and sat down. Damien Moretti arrived 8 minutes after her. No assistant, no entourage, no preliminary small talk from an intermediary. He came in, closed the door behind him, and sat across the table from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked the same as he had outside the estate. Dark suit, no tie again. There was something about his quality of attention that she'd noticed before. The way he looked at her as though he was actually listening to something she hadn't said yet. "You prepared," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't bother denying it. "I read everything publicly available on the Moretti Group." And? "The legitimate holdings are underperforming relative to their market position. The real estate division has a liquidity problem it's been managing with short-term instruments that won't hold past 18 months. The logistics subsidiary has 3 contracts up for renewal simultaneously in Q4, and the margins on 2 of them are already thin." She paused. "You have good assets. They're being managed reactively. Someone is making decisions under pressure instead of ahead of it." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, something more like recognition. "My current CFO," he said, "has been with me for 11 years. "Then he's too comfortable," Charlotte said. "Comfortable people don't see problems until the problems introduce themselves." Damien was quiet for a moment. "The role I'm offering is not CFO." "I know. What is it?" "Senior Strategy Executive, scope, full access to the legitimate operations, authority to audit, restructure, and recommend. Final decisions remain mine." He held her gaze. "You would not be managing my other interests." The word other sat in the room between them. Charlotte kept her voice level. "I need that in writing." "You'll have it. I need to be able to take my findings to outside legal counsel if I believe something I've uncovered requires it." "Agreed." She looked at him. "You're agreeing very quickly." "Because those are reasonable conditions," Damien said. "And because I'm not interested in hiring someone I have to deceive." She studied him for another long moment. He didn't fidget. He didn't rush her. He sat with the quality of a man who had learned that most things worth having required waiting for. "Why me?" she said. "Specifically, there are 100 analysts in the city with similar qualifications. There are analysts with similar technical skills," he said. "Not similar judgment." He paused. "The Kellerman report. You were 30 years old, junior consultant. Your supervising partner told you to bury it." "He didn't tell me to bury it. He told me to minimize it. And you didn't." "No." "Why not?" Charlotte looked at the table for a moment. "Because the people being defrauded were real. They weren't abstractions. They were employees with retirement accounts and shareholders who'd been lied to." She looked back up. "I can't unsee things once I've seen them." Damien nodded once, slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already believed. "That's why," he said simply. She started on a Monday. The first thing that happened was that Marcus Hale, the CFO, the one who had been there 11 years, looked at her like she was a staph infection that had somehow gotten through the building's air filtration system. He was 53, gray at the temples, with the physique of a man who had once been athletic and the expression of one who deeply resented being assessed by someone younger and female. He shook her hand in a way that was technically correct and emotionally hostile. "Welcome to the Moretti Group," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "Thank you," Charlotte said, in a tone that meant she had noticed. The second thing that happened was that she was given an office, good-sized, corner, with a view that was not quite the conference room view but respectable, and then discovered that the access she had been promised to the financial systems was partially blocked by permissions that had not yet been updated. She spent the first 3 hours of her first day composing politely worded but architecturally precise emails to the IT department requesting the specific access she required. By noon, she had received responses explaining that the permissions required approval from department heads. By 2 o'clock, she had identified that 2 of the 3 relevant department heads reported to Marcus Hale. She went to Marcus Hale's office at 2:15. He was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at her. The particular gesture of a man who wants you to understand the hierarchy before you've even opened your mouth. She stood in his doorway and waited. He finished his call in his own time, set the phone down with deliberate slowness, and then looked at her with the expression of a man prepared to be patient in the most aggressive way possible. "The system's access," Charlotte said. "Going through the normal process," Marcus said. "Can't rush IT. The permissions require approval from Henderson and Park, both of whom report to you. They're department heads. They operate independently." "Marcus." She said his name flatly, not unkindly, just flat, I'm going to need that access by end of business today. If it isn't sorted by 5 o'clock, I'll need to escalate it. I'd rather not do that on my first day, but I will." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. His jaw did something careful. "I'll see what I can do." The access was updated by 4:30. She worked until 9 that first evening. Then she went home, ate something she barely tasted, and slept for 5 hours and 20 minutes before she was back at her desk at 6:15. The real estate division's books took her 4 days to get through properly. Not because they were complex, boo. They were, but that wasn't the problem. But because they had been organized in a way that seemed straightforward until you looked at it from the right angle, at which point you could see that information had been arranged to answer questions that anyone looking casually would ask, while making the questions you actually needed to ask much harder to form. Not fraud, not quite, but the fingerprints of someone who understood how to manage perception. On Friday of her first week, she found the first one. A series of intercompany transfers between the real estate subsidiary, the subsidiary, and a logistics holding entity, each one small enough to be individually unremarkable, collectively large enough to represent a significant and undisclosed liability. The transfers had been ongoing for 22 months. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she printed the relevant pages, put them in a folder, and went to find Damien. He was in his office, the actual one, the one on the 32nd floor that she'd been told was rarely used for meetings. And he was on the phone, standing at the window with his back to the door. His assistant had let her in. He turned when he heard her, registered the folder in her hand, and wrapped up his call in under 30 seconds. "Show me," he said. She laid it out on his desk. He stood beside her and looked at the pages without touching them. She walked him through it. The transfer pattern, the timeline, the aggregate figure, the liability implications. When she finished, there was a silence. "Henderson," Damien said. Not a question. "The authorization signatures are his." "For 22 months." "Yes." Damien straightened up. He turned and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her. She watched the set of his shoulders. "All right," he said. "I need to know if you want me to continue or..." "Continue?" He didn't turn around. "Document everything. I want a full audit trail." A pause. "This stays between us until you've finished." "Understood." She picked up the folder. She was almost at the door when he said, "Charlotte?" She stopped. "This is going to get uncomfortable," he said. He was still looking out the window. "Henderson is not the only one. When you find the others, and you will find them, there will be pressure. People who have been here a long time will push back. Some of them will go over your head." "To you?" "They'll try." He turned then, looked at her across the length of the office. "I'm telling you this now so that when it happens, you don't mistake the pressure for a signal to stop." Charlotte held the folder in both hands. "I don't stop," she said. Something in his face was very still. "No," he said. "I didn't think you did." She went back to work. The discomfort Damien had predicted arrived on a Wednesday 3 weeks later, in the form of a conversation she hadn't been invited to. She had come back from a lunch she had eaten at her desk, a habit she had fallen into, not by design, but because the lunch hour was quieter and she could think more clearly. And as she passed the small conference room on the 31st floor, she heard Marcus Hale's voice through the partially open door. "Completely out of her depth," Marcus was saying. "She doesn't understand the relationships. The way these accounts are structured has a history, context. She's looking at numbers without understanding what they're attached to." Another voice, one she recognized as belonging to Paul Greer, head of the real estate division and Henderson's direct superior. "Damien brought her in. We can't just..." Damien brought in a 34-year-old with no executive leadership experience who got the job because she knows somebody. Marcus's voice had the particular confidence of a man saying something in what he believes is a private space. "She is going to destabilize 3 years of work because she doesn't know what she doesn't know. Someone needs to talk to him." Charlotte stood in the corridor. She was holding a paper coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold about an hour ago, and she hadn't thrown it out yet. She thought about walking away. She thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. Then she pushed the door open. Marcus went still. Paul Greer turned the color of old brick. Charlotte looked at Marcus. "I have no executive leadership experience," she said. "You're right about that." She stepped into the room, which made both men take a small, involuntary step backward. "What I do have is 27 months of undisclosed intercompany transfers in the real estate to logistics channel, authorized signatures from Henderson, and a liability figure that would significantly alter how your Q4 report looks to outside auditors." She set the cold coffee cup on the conference table. "So I'd suggest that whoever's planning to talk to Damien consider carefully what they're walking into that conversation knowing." She left the door open when she walked out. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. The conversation happened anyway. Marcus requested a meeting with Damien that afternoon. She knew because his assistant mentioned it, casually, while scheduling something else. She did not ask for details. She went back to the audit. Damien did not mention the meeting to her. What he did was send an email to the entire executive team at 5:45 that afternoon, 11 minutes after Marcus would have left his office, copying Charlotte. Effective immediately, all financial system access requests for the strategy division will be processed within 4 hours of submission. Priority designation Alpha. Any questions, contact me directly. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to her personal email as documentation and kept working. The audit expanded. The more she looked, the more she found. Not because the Moretti Group's legitimate operations were fundamentally corrupt, but because they had been managed for years by people who had learned to treat proximity to power as a kind of insulation. Small liberties, individually defensible, collectively corrosive. Expenses that didn't quite add up. Contracts awarded to vendors with personal connections that were never disclosed. Performance reviews that had nothing to do with performance. She documented all of it. She built a folder that was growing thicker every week. She cross-referenced everything twice before she noted it, because she understood that the moment she made a claim she couldn't substantiate, the conversation would stop being about the corruption and start being about her. It was during the audit's 5th week that she saw Ethan's name for the first time. She almost missed it. It was in a vendor contract, 2 years old, for a consulting engagement with a firm called Meridian Advisory Group. Standard-looking contract, reasonable scope, fees within normal range. She would have moved on except for the signatory on the vendor side, E. Mercer, managing director. She sat very still. Meridian Advisory Group. She pulled the corporate registration. Incorporated 26 months ago. 1 registered officer. Address. A shared office space in the West Loop. She pulled the contract deliverables. Vague. Deliberately vague. The kind of scope language that could mean almost anything in practice, and therefore meant nothing specific in the event of any scrutiny. She pulled the payment records. Full payment had been made in 3 installments across an 8-month period. Total, $212,000. She pulled the deliverable reports. There were 2. Both were thin. Both were largely composed of material that a competent analyst could have produced in a long weekend. $212,000. She looked at the contract date. It had been signed 14 months before Ethan's company received its funding from Richard Hale. The Hale introduction that Charlotte had arranged through Damien's favor. Her brain was doing the arithmetic she didn't want it to do. She got up from her desk. She walked to the window. She pressed her forehead against the glass for exactly 3 seconds, feeling the cold of it, which helped. Then she straightened up and went back to the desk and looked at the document again. She thought, I need to verify before I think about what this means. She verified. It took 2 days, and it was worse at the end of those 2 days than it had been at the beginning. The Meridian engagement had been arranged by Henderson, the same Henderson whose signatures were on the intercompany transfers. The payments had been processed through the same channel. There was no record of any meeting, any presentation, any formal engagement of any kind between Meridian Advisory Group and any Moretti Group entity. $212,000 for reports that didn't justify $2,000. She built the documentation the same way she built all of it. Precise, cross-referenced, chronological. She did not let herself think about the wedding. She did not let herself think about the dress she had ironed, or the pitch deck she had rebuilt, or the loan she had taken against her own savings. She thought about the numbers. She thought about accuracy. She thought about the innocent employees who worked for these companies, and had no idea that the men above them were running a private economy of favors and payments inside the legitimate one. On a Thursday morning, 7 weeks into her employment, she brought the full file to Damien. He read it in his office while she sat across from him. He read the way he did everything, without visible reaction, without rushing, going back twice to cross-reference sections she had flagged. It took 40 minutes. She drank water and waited. When he finished, he closed the folder and set it on the desk. He looked at her. "You know who Mercer is to you," he said. "Yes." "And you brought it anyway?" "Yes." Something moved across his expression. Not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter and more specific than either. He looked at the folder on the desk between them and then back at her. "Everyone will say it's personal," he said. Not as a warning, as a statement of what was coming. "I know," Charlotte said. "It doesn't change what's in the file." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. The city was visible through the window behind him, 47 stories of it, the lake a flat gray line at the edge of the frame. She could hear the particular silence of a room where a significant decision was being made. "I'm going to give you full authority to lead the investigation," Damien said. "Complete scope, whatever you need." His eyes were steady on hers. "This is your call, Charlotte, not mine. I want to be clear about that." She understood what he was offering, not just authority, cover. The acknowledgement that this was her decision to make, not his assignment to give her. The difference mattered, and he knew it. She thought about what it meant to accept, what it meant for every person in every office of every company that had been funding this private economy of corruption. What it meant for the employees who had watched promotions go to the wrong people for the wrong reasons and had never been able to name why. She thought about Ethan's face in that corridor, the glass of whiskey, the way his eyes had moved past her. Then she set that aside entirely because it was not the reason she was going to do this. "I'll need subpoena-equivalent internal authority," she said. "Access to all personnel files, all payment records, all communications archives for the relevant period. You'll have it by end of day. I'll need a direct line to outside legal counsel, independent of the company's existing legal team." "Agreed." "And I'll need you to be prepared for the fact that this is going to be significantly more visible than you may want." She held his gaze. "When I finish, this won't be containable. There will be dismissals, possibly referrals to external authorities depending on what I find. People who have been in this company for years will be gone." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "Do it right," he said. "That's all I'm asking." Charlotte picked up her copy of the file. She stood up. She was at the door when she felt it. The particular weight of a threshold she was crossing that could not be uncrossed. She recognized it the same way she had recognized the hairline fracture at the wedding. Something structural, something with permanent consequences in both directions. She put her hand on the doorframe, not hesitating, just acknowledging it. Then she walked out, and the investigation began. The investigation did not announce itself. It moved the way Charlotte moved, quietly, methodically, with the particular patience of someone who understood that the goal was not speed, but accuracy, and that accuracy required letting the evidence build its own architecture before you started drawing conclusions. She commandeered a secondary conference room on the 31st floor and converted it into a working space that was, within a week, papered with printed ledger pages, timeline charts, and cross-reference grids that she had built by hand because she trusted her own spatial reasoning more than any software visualization. She worked with two people, a junior analyst named Priya Kapoor, who had been recommended by the legal team and who had the quality Charlotte valued most in collaborators. She asked good questions and didn't fill silences with bad answers. And an outside counsel named Daniel Reeves, a former federal prosecutor, who was precise to the point of occasional social difficulty and whom Charlotte liked immediately for exactly that reason. The external access Damien had promised arrived on schedule. The internal resistance arrived slightly ahead of schedule. On the second day of the formal investigation, Paul Greer submitted a written complaint to HR alleging that Charlotte's audit methods constituted a hostile working environment. The complaint was detailed and specific and entirely strategic. It named 3 incidents in which Charlotte had, according to Greer, spoken to staff members in a manner that was, quote, intimidating and professionally inappropriate. Charlotte read the complaint. Then she wrote a 4-paragraph response that documented the factual record of each named incident, including the date, the participants, and the content of what had actually been said, and submitted it to HR and to Damien simultaneously. Damien's response was a single line, "Noted. Continue." The complaint was not mentioned again. Marcus Hale took a different approach. He did not file complaints. He did what experienced bureaucratic fighters do. He began managing information flow. Requests for communications archives from certain departments were suddenly routed through additional approval layers that had not existed the week before. Response timelines stretched. Files that should have taken a day to retrieve took 4. Charlotte documented every delay, every new approval layer, every stretched timeline, with dates and the names of the individuals responsible for each obstruction. She brought the documentation to Reeves, the outside counsel, on a Friday afternoon. Reeves looked at the timeline chart. He was a compact man in his 50s with the manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people lied to him and had developed a comprehensive intolerance for it. "This is obstruction," he said. "It's administrative friction," Charlotte said. "Carefully constructed administrative friction. Same thing with better paperwork." He tapped the chart. "You want to go to Moretti?" "Not yet. I want to give them the opportunity to produce what I've requested voluntarily. If they don't, I want the documented record that they were given the chance." Reeves looked at her over the top of his glasses. "You've done this before." "Once," she said. "Sort of." She had not, in fact, formally led an investigation before. She had filed a fraud report at 30 years old and watched it disappear into a machine she didn't control. This was different in every structural way. She had authority here. She had resources. She had Damien's explicit backing. But the fundamental skill was the same, the ability to look at a large and complicated deception and hold it in her mind without flinching long enough to understand its shape. She was 6 weeks into the investigation when she found the second layer. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Priya had gone home. Reeves had gone home. Charlotte was alone in the conference room at 8:15, working through a set of communications archives that had finally been produced after 11 days of documented requests and 2 formal escalations. She was reading emails between Henderson and Greer from 23 months ago, looking for discussion of the Meridian contract, when she found an email thread that was not about Meridian at all. The thread was between Henderson and a name she didn't recognize, R. Calloway. The email address was a personal Gmail account, not a company address. The subject line was blank. The content was brief. Henderson had written, "Confirmed. Package received. Second installment per original terms." R. Calloway had replied 2 hours later, "Good. Tell him the timeline holds. He needs to maintain the Q3 numbers regardless of what the audit shows." M knows. Charlotte read it 3 times. M knows. She sat with that for a moment. M. The obvious candidates: Marcus, Moretti. Her stomach did something she made herself ignore. She printed the email. She looked at the date, 23 months ago, which placed it 4 months before the Meridian contract had been executed. She pulled the email thread forward in time. There were 11 more emails in the chain, spread across 7 months. She read them all. The picture that assembled itself was worse than the one she had come into the room with. The Meridian payments were not a standalone corruption event. They were part of a larger financial arrangement that had been routed through at least 3 separate entities, and that appeared to be providing a consistent cash flow to someone outside the company, someone whose name did not appear anywhere in the chain except as an initial. R. Calloway. She ran the name through every corporate database she had access to. 3R, Calloway's in Illinois. None of them had any corporate registration connected to the Moretti Group or any of its subsidiaries. She ran the Gmail address through the communications archives for every department she had access to. It appeared in 2 places, Henderson's archive and one other. The other was Marcus Hale's archive, 14 months ago, in a forwarded email that Marcus had sent to his own personal account. The forward contained a single attachment, a PDF she couldn't open because it was password protected. She stared at the screen. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she had saved under Damien's name. He had given it to her in her second week for operational urgency. That read, "Office. Now, if you can." She gathered the printed emails. She went upstairs. Damien's office at 8:30 at night had a different quality than it did during business hours. The city outside the window was darker and more specific, the building quieter, the space between people more honest somehow. He was standing when she came in, which was unusual, and there was a quality to his stillness that she had learned to read as controlled tension. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She had the printed emails in her hand. She set them on the desk. "I found something tonight," she said. "But I think you found something too." He looked at the emails, then he looked at her. "What did you find?" She walked him through it, the thread, the initials, the pattern, Marcus's forwarded attachment. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she watched him decide something. "R. Calloway," he said. "Robert Calloway. He managed legal affairs for my holdings from 2017 to 2021. He left under circumstances I believed at the time were straightforward." A pause. "I had reason to revisit that belief about 6 months ago." "What reason?" "A discrepancy in a property filing. Small. The kind of thing that shouldn't have been wrong." He picked up one of the printed emails and read it again. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. "M knows," he said. "I need to know what that means," Charlotte said. Her voice was steady, and she was proud of it. Damien set the email down. He looked at her directly. "It could mean Marcus. It could mean me. It could mean someone else with that initial entirely." He held her gaze. "I need you to know that I did not know about any of this." Charlotte looked at him for a long, careful moment. She was 34 years old, and she had spent 4 years being wrong about someone in a way that had cost her significantly. She was not going to be careless now. "I believe you," she said, "but I need to follow the evidence wherever it goes." "Yes," he said, "you do. Including if it leads somewhere you don't want it to go." He held her gaze without flinching. "Especially then." She went home at 11 and slept badly and was back at 6, and by 9 o'clock the next morning, the investigation had changed shape entirely because Priya had come in early and found something that Charlotte had not found the night before. A second set of communications archives from a server partition that had not been included in the original access grant, which had been quietly added to the system permissions overnight by someone who had, apparently, made a mistake. The mistake was that they had added it to Charlotte's access instead of removing it from the backup server. Priya stood in the doorway of the conference room holding a printed page and looking like she wasn't sure whether to be excited or frightened. "You need to see this," she said. Charlotte took the page. It was an email from Marcus Hale to Ethan Mercer, dated 18 months ago, and it was not vague at all. It laid out, in specific terms, an arrangement by which Mercer's firm, operating as Meridian Advisory Group, would receive payment in exchange for providing financial modeling that would be used to support a particular valuation of Meredi Group real estate assets. The valuation, the email specified, should land within a specific range. A range, Charlotte could see at a glance, that was materially higher than the actual market value of the assets in question. She looked at the number. Then she looked at the date. Then she looked at the email address in the CC field, which she had almost missed because it was positioned at the end of a long list. The CC address was madeline.sterling@gmail.com. Charlotte sat down, not dramatically. Just, her legs made the decision before her conscious mind did, and she was sitting, and the page was in her hands, and the conference room was very quiet. Madeline, her cousin, Ethan's wife. The woman who had walked down the aisle in Charlotte's planning, with Charlotte's flowers, to a man Charlotte had built from the raw material of his own mediocrity. Madeline had known, not just known, been copied on the arrangement, had an email address in the chain, had received the terms of the agreement in writing 18 months ago, which was 6 months before Ethan had stopped being Charlotte's fiancé and started becoming something else. Charlotte looked at the page for a very long time. Priya was still standing in the doorway. Charlotte became aware of this and looked up. "Pull everything on that server partition," Charlotte said. Her voice came out level. "Every communication, every attachment, chronological order. I need it by noon." Priya left. Charlotte set the page down on the table. She pressed both palms flat on the surface. She breathed. One breath, two, three. The kind of deliberate breathing she had learned years ago when her father died and she had had to give the eulogy with 20 minutes' notice and no time to fall apart. She had known the investigation was personal. She had been prepared for it to be uncomfortable. She had not been prepared for Madeline's name to be in the CC field of a fraudulent payment arrangement, because the particular cruelty of that was not something she had allocated space for. She thought, I need to keep moving. She kept moving. By noon, she had the full partition contents. By 2 o'clock, she and Priya and Reeves were working through it systematically. By 4:15, they understood the complete shape of what had happened, and it was the kind of understanding that made the room feel smaller and the air feel used up. Marcus Hale had been siphoning value from the Moretti Group's legitimate holdings for 3 years, not in ways that were immediately visible, nothing so crude, but through a layered system of inflated vendor payments, suppressed asset valuations, and strategic misdirection of capital toward entities that either didn't exist or existed only to receive and redistribute the money. Ethan's Meridian engagement was one of at least 6 such vendor arrangements. The total across 3 years was, conservatively, $4.3 million. Robert Calloway had been the architect. He had built the system during his time as legal affairs director and had left when Damien had begun asking questions about the property discrepancy. Not fired, not investigated, just strategically departed, leaving the system running behind him like a machine left on in an empty room. Marcus had maintained it. Greer had benefited from it at a smaller scale. Henderson had been the operations layer, executing the transactions. And Ethan Mercer had been a vendor, one of several, not the linchpin, but a knowing and willing participant who had received $212,000 for reports that were designed not to inform, but to support a valuation that served the scheme. Madeline had known. The CC on that email was not an accident. There were 2 more emails in the partition archive that included her address. She had not replied to any of them, which was either deliberate or simply the behavior of a woman who understood that not putting things in writing was its own form of participation. Charlotte sat in the conference room at 4:45 and looked at the summary document she had been building all day and understood that she was holding evidence that would end Ethan Mercer's career and potentially result in criminal referrals for multiple individuals, including her cousin, and that she had assembled it herself, and that every piece of it was accurate, and that it had nothing to do with the wedding, and nothing to do with the dress, and nothing to do with the 4 years, and nothing to do with the cold coffee cup, and nothing to do with standing at the top of those stone steps with a black card in her hand. It had to do with $4.3 million, and the people who worked in these companies who had been watching promotions and contracts go to the wrong people for 3 years without understanding why. She thought, I can do this. Then Reeves walked in with a single page in his hand and said, There's a problem, and set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It was a memo, internal, dated 4 days ago. She didn't recognize the formatting. It wasn't from any of the Moretti Group's standard templates. The header identified it as originating from the office of the company's internal general counsel, a man named Foster she had interacted with twice and found professionally opaque. The memo was addressed to the board of directors. Its subject line read, Concerns regarding investigation methodology and authorization. She read it. Foster had drafted a 4-page legal argument contending that Charlotte's investigation had been improperly authorized, that the scope of authority Damien had granted her verbally and in writing exceeded what could be delegated to a non-officer employee under the company's existing governance structure, and that any findings produced under that authority were potentially inadmissible in any legal proceeding and exposed the company to significant liability. He further argued that the investigation should be suspended pending a formal review by the full board, and that all materials gathered to date should be placed in escrow. Charlotte read it twice. She looked at Reeves. Foster. He copied 4 board members, Reeves said. Not all of them, 4 specifically. He pointed to the names. Hale has a personal relationship with 2 of them. Greer's brother-in-law is a 3rd. When was this sent? Yesterday morning. Why are we only seeing it now? Because it was sent to a board email distribution list that doesn't route through the standard communications archive. I got it from outside counsel's copy. He paused. Someone gave Foster the playbook for this. The legal argument is technically sophisticated. Foster didn't write this alone. Charlotte looked at the memo. She thought about the timeline. The partition access mistake had added the server to her permissions 2 nights ago, which meant someone had noticed the mistake and realized what she had found, or guessed it, and commissioned this memo within 48 hours. They were moving to shut her down before she could formalize the findings. Can they do it? She said. Legally, can they actually suspend the investigation? Reeves was quiet for a moment, which was its own answer. The governance argument has some technical merit. It's not how I'd read the bylaws, but it's not frivolous. If 4 board members formally request suspension, he stopped. It would create a legal dispute that could take months to resolve, during which time, of course, the investigation is paused. Documents get lost, people get lawyers, memories get managed. Charlotte looked at the window. The lake was invisible from this angle at this hour, just city. I need to talk to Damien, she said. He already knows, Reeves said. I called him before I came in here. He wants to meet, tonight. She gathered the summary document and the memo and the printed email with Madeline's address in the CC field, and she put them all in the folder and she went upstairs. Damien's office was different at 6 o'clock than it had been at 8:30 the night before. There were 2 other people in it. A woman Charlotte hadn't met, introduced as Elena Vasquez, the company's outside securities counsel, and a man named Briggs, who was apparently Damien's personal attorney, and who looked at Charlotte with the precise, weighing expression of someone deciding how much of a problem she was. Charlotte sat down and put the folder on the table and looked at Damien. Tell me where we are, Damien said. She told him. All of it. The full findings, the 4.3 million, the 6 vendor entities, Callaway's architecture, Marcus and Greer and Henderson, Ethan's role, and the memo. She laid it out with the same flatness and precision she used for everything, and she watched the people in the room as she spoke. Vasquez took notes. Briggs kept his expression neutral and watchful. Damien did not look away from Charlotte's face once during the entire recitation. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Mercer, Damien said. Just the name. Yes. You found this. I found all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Vasquez. The Foster memo. Vasquez set her pen down. The governance argument is thin, but it's a real argument. If 4 board members align on a suspension request, we're in litigation before we're in remediation. That's a 6-month delay minimum. And during that time, Briggs said, looking at Charlotte, your findings are in escrow, which means anything criminal gets cold. Charlotte looked at Briggs. She had not liked him immediately, and her assessment had not improved. I'm aware of what escrow means. I'm making sure we're aligned on the stakes, Briggs said. We're aligned. Damien's hand moved on the desk, a small gesture, 2 fingers lifted and set down, and the room quieted. What do you need? He said to Charlotte. Not what do you recommend. Not what does the situation require. What do you need? Charlotte looked at the folder on the table. She thought about the 4.3 million. She thought about 3 years of promotions going to the wrong people. She thought about Priya coming in early and finding the server partition and standing in the doorway with a printed page looking like she wasn't sure whether to be excited or frightened. She thought about what Ethan's name in that vendor contract meant, and what Madeline's address in the CC field meant, and what it meant that she had found it herself, and that she was going to have to be the one to decide what to do with it. I need the board meeting moved up, she said, not suspended, advanced. I need to present the findings formally before Foster's memo can establish a procedural framework. I need 48 hours. Vasquez looked at Damien. Something moved between them. Not words, just the particular compression of communication between people who have worked together for a long time. I can call an emergency board session, Damien said. The bylaws allow it under specific conditions. What conditions? Reeves asked. Evidence of material financial harm to the company, Damien said. He looked at Charlotte's folder. I think we have that. The board session was scheduled for Thursday at 9 a.m. That gave Charlotte 36 hours. She went back to the conference room. She told Priya to go home and get 6 hours of sleep and be back at 5 in the morning. She told Reeves the same thing. Then she sat down alone with the summary document and began to rebuild it from the beginning, Not because it was wrong, but because she was about to stand in a room full of people who had every incentive to find a reason to dismiss her, and the document needed to be so complete, so precise, so exhaustively cross-referenced that the only way to reject it was to reject the evidence itself. She worked until 1 in the morning. She went home and slept for 3 hours and 20 minutes and showered and came back. At 5:15, Priya arrived with coffee and the expression of someone who understood that something significant was happening and intended to be useful. At 6, Reeves arrived with 2 associate attorneys Charlotte hadn't met and a revised legal brief. At 6:45, she received a text from Damien's number. 4 board members have confirmed attendance. The other 2 are remote. Foster will be present. She read the text. She set her phone down. She looked at the document in front of her. She had 31 pages of findings, 47 exhibits, a financial summary that was, to the best of her ability, and Reeves's combined review, incontestable. She also had a page she had not shown to anyone yet, a single printed email with a CC field containing her cousin's personal email address. She had kept it separate from the formal exhibits because she had not yet decided what it meant for the investigation's formal scope, and because the decision of what to do with it was one she needed to make clearly and not under pressure. She pulled it from the folder. She looked at it. madeline.sterling@gmail.com. She thought about her cousin arriving at the estate 90 minutes late in a cloud of perfume. She thought about the air kiss. "You look exhausted." She thought about Ethan's glass of whiskey and his eyes moving past her face to somewhere else. She thought about Patricia Marsh's voice in the alcove. She's like a golden retriever. You throw her a task and she fetches it. She thought about 4 years, the loan, the pitch decks, the late nights, the phone calls at 11 p.m. when Ethan couldn't manage the anxiety of the funding process, and she had talked him through it with a patience she had never once asked him to reciprocate. She put the page in the formal exhibits, not because it would satisfy any personal need. She was, she realized, surprisingly empty of that particular hunger, but because Madeline's knowledge of the arrangement was part of the factual record, and the factual record was not hers to edit for emotional convenience. She labeled it Exhibit 48. She placed it at the back. At 8:50, she gathered the folder and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the 33rd floor, where the boardroom was. And as the elevator rose, she stood straight and breathed evenly, and thought about nothing except the 31 pages and the 48 exhibits and the $4.3 million and the people who deserved to know the truth about where their company's money had gone. The elevator doors opened. Foster was standing in the corridor outside the boardroom, talking to one of the 4 board members who had been copied on his memo. He saw Charlotte come off the elevator and he stopped talking and looked at her with an expression that contained several calculations happening simultaneously. Charlotte looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she walked past him and pushed open the boardroom door and went inside, and she set her folder on the table, and she looked at the room. 7 people, 8 counting Foster, who had followed her in, Damien at the far end of the table with his hands flat on the surface and his face doing the particular stillness she had come to understand as something different from calm. And she thought, this is the room where it ends, or it doesn't. She opened the folder. She looked up. "Good morning," she said. "I'm going to walk you through 31 pages of findings that represent the most significant internal fraud this company has experienced in its history. I'd ask that you hold your questions until I've finished, because the picture I'm going to show you will answer most of them before you need to ask." Nobody spoke. Charlotte looked down at page 1, and the woman who had spent 4 years building other people's futures began, for the first time, to dismantle something that deserved to be dismantled. The boardroom had 12 chairs and 8 people, and the particular quality of air that accumulates in rooms where significant amounts of money are at stake, dense, slightly pressurized, with an undertone of something that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. Charlotte stood at the head of the table. She had not sat down. Standing was a deliberate choice, not for dominance, but because she needed to feel her feet on the floor, needed the physical reality of her own weight as an anchor while she did this. She started with the numbers, not the names, not the narrative, not the most dramatic elements, the numbers first, because numbers were the language everyone in this room spoke fluently and without defensiveness, and because she wanted them committed to the financial reality before she gave them anything they could respond to emotionally. 31 pages. She had arranged them with the precision of someone who had done this in her head many times before she ever sat down to write it. The structure moved from macro to micro. Aggregate financial impact first, then the mechanism, then the individual actors, then the documentation. By the time she reached the individual actors, the room would already understand the shape of what had happened, which meant the names would land not as accusations, but as the inevitable conclusion of arithmetic. She was on page 4 when Foster interrupted her. Ms. Ashford. His voice had the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent a career using procedural language as a weapon. Before we go further, the board should be aware that the authorization framework for this investigation is page 28, Charlotte said without looking up from the document. A pause. I'm sorry? The authorization framework. It's addressed on page 28. I've included the relevant bylaw provisions, the written authorization from Mr. Moretti in his capacity as principal officer, and outside counsel's legal opinion on the scope question. She looked up then, directly at Foster. I anticipated the concern. I addressed it. If you want to raise it now, before we've established the financial context, you're welcome to, but I'd suggest it will make more sense to the board after they've seen what the authorization was used to find. Foster looked at her. He had pale eyes and the quality of someone who was recalibrating. Let her finish, said one of the board members, a woman named Carla Simmons, who had been with the board for 6 years and who Charlotte had researched carefully and identified as the person in the room most likely to respond to precision rather than politics. Foster sat back. He was not finished. Charlotte knew that. She kept going. By page 9, the room had changed temperature. She could feel it. Not literally, but in the quality of attention, which had shifted from the particular wariness of people waiting for a presentation they intended to challenge to something more alert and more uncomfortable. The aggregate numbers were doing what aggregate numbers do when they are large enough and documented thoroughly enough. They were becoming real. $4.3 million across 31 months. She watched the board member on her left, a man named Kenneth Rao, one of the two who had been copied on Foster's memo. Look at the transfer chart on page 11 and do something she had been waiting for. He looked up from the page and looked at Marcus Hale, who was sitting 2 chairs down from him on the right side of the table. Marcus was looking at the table surface. His jaw was set. He had the expression of someone choosing very carefully between available positions and finding none of them adequate. Charlotte moved to page 14. Vendor entities. She named them one by one, with their registration dates, their single registered officers, their payment totals. When she reached Meridian Advisory Group, she read the name and the total, $212,000. And she kept her voice at precisely the same register she had used for the 5 entities that preceded it. She did not look at anyone when she said the name Mercer. She was on page 19 when Marcus stood up. He didn't shout. He was too experienced for that. He pushed back his chair and stood and said, in a voice that was controlled but carrying a vibration underneath it, like a bridge in high wind, I want it noted for the record that I have not been given the opportunity to review these findings or respond to any allegation before being presented with them in this setting. Charlotte stopped. She looked at him. You were informed of the investigation's scope and authorization on day 1. You've been aware of the investigation for 7 weeks. The formal findings document was completed at 11:50 last night. If you'd like 24 hours to prepare a written response before the board takes any action, I would support that request. Marcus looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprised, she thought, that she had offered him anything at all. Yes, I'd want that. Noted, said Carla Simmons. She looked at Damien. Is that acceptable? The findings stand regardless of the response timeline, Damien said. His voice was even. We can allow for a written response before final board action. Marcus sat back down. He sat down the way a man sits when he knows that sitting down is the only move available to him, and the knowledge of it is its own particular kind of defeat. Charlotte continued. She finished the presentation at 11:17. The room was quiet in a way that had texture to it, the silence of people processing something they couldn't argue with but hadn't fully metabolized yet. Carla Simmons spoke first. What are you recommending? Immediate suspension of Marcus Hale, Paul Greer, and James Henderson pending a formal HR and legal review. Termination of all vendor relationships identified in the report. Referral of the financial findings to outside legal counsel for assessment of potential criminal liability. And an independent audit of all transactions flagged in the report, conducted by a firm with no prior relationship with the Moretti Group. The referral, Rao said carefully, to external authorities. That determination would be made by outside counsel based on their assessment of the evidence. Not by me, and not by this board directly. She paused. But I want to be clear. I believe the evidence warrants that assessment. The room was quiet again. Foster said, "The governance question." "Page 28, Charlotte said. This time someone at the table almost smiled. The meeting ran for another 90 minutes. Charlotte answered every question with the document open in front of her, pointing to the specific exhibit that addressed each one. She did not speculate. She did not editorialize. She did not use the word revenge or the word personal or the word betrayal, because those words were not in the 31 pages, and she was not going to let them into the room now. At 12:47, Carla Simmons called for a preliminary vote on the suspension recommendations. 5 in favor, 1 abstention, 1 opposed. Rao, who said he wanted to wait for Marcus's written response, which was a position Charlotte understood and did not argue with because she had already won what needed to be won today. Foster voted in favor of the suspensions. She noticed that. She filed it away. The meeting ended. People gathered papers and moved toward the door. Charlotte stayed at the head of the table, organizing the exhibit folders back into sequence, and she kept her hands steady through the effort of will that left a faint ache across her knuckles. Marcus passed her on his way out. He stopped. She looked up. His face was the face of a man who had not slept well and would not sleep well for some time, and beneath the anger, which was real, which she could feel from 3 feet away like heat from an open oven, there was something rawer and more complicated. "You know what you've done," he said, not loud, almost quiet. "Yes," Charlotte said. 11 years. His voice was still controlled, but the bridge and wind quality was back, more pronounced. 11 years I built the infrastructure that those legitimate operations run on. Every system, every relationship, He stopped. Started again. "You came in here 8 weeks ago, and you have no idea what you're looking at." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "I know exactly what I'm looking at, Marcus. That's the problem." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked out. She stood in the empty boardroom for 90 seconds. Then she packed the folder, picked it up, and left. Damien found her in the corridor outside. He fell into step beside her without preamble, and they walked in silence to the elevator and took it down to the 31st floor and walked to his office and went inside, and she sat down and set the folder on his desk and felt, for the first time since 5 in the morning, the full weight of being tired. "You did it cleanly," he said. "I did it accurately," she said. "That's all I can claim." He sat across from her. He looked like a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and was deciding whether this was the moment to set it down. "Marcus will submit a response that challenges the methodology," he said. "His attorney will draft it. It will be technically sophisticated and factually irrelevant." "I know." Rao will waver. "I know." "It's not over." "I know," Charlotte said. "It never is until it is." She went back to work. The afternoon was administrative, documentation, chain of custody procedures for the exhibit files, 2 calls with Reeves about the criminal referral language, 1 call with Priya about the independent audit firm's preliminary engagement terms. She ate half a sandwich at 3 o'clock, standing at the window of the conference room, and didn't taste any of it. At 4:50, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Charlotte Ashford." A pause. Then, "Charlotte." A voice she recognized immediately and had not heard since the morning of the wedding, when she had handed over a bouquet with a steady hand. "Madeline." Charlotte's hand tightened on the phone. She turned away from the room. Priya was still at the table, and walked to the far corner near the window. "Madeline," she said, "I need to talk to you." Her cousin's voice had lost its particular construction, the layered confidence that Charlotte had always read as performance. What was left underneath was thinner and had an edge of something that might have been fear or might have been fury. For Madeline, those two things had always been difficult to distinguish. "All right," Charlotte said. "Not on the phone. In person." Charlotte looked at the city outside. "When?" "Tonight, 7 o'clock. The bar at the Langham." She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "I'll be there." She arrived 8 minutes early and sat with water and looked at the entrance. Madeline came in at 7:03 in a coat that cost more than Charlotte's first car, and with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times on the way over and was already second-guessing the script. She sat down. She did not order anything. She looked at Charlotte across the small table with the particular intensity of someone who has abandoned all of their usual social management tools and is operating on something more direct. "How much did you find?" Madeline said. "Everything," Charlotte said. Madeline's jaw tightened. "My name is on one email." 3 emails, 1 with the arrangement terms, 2 with follow-up communications. Charlotte kept her voice level. "You were CC'd, not a primary sender. I'm aware of the distinction." "Then you know I wasn't—" "I know you knew," Charlotte said. "That's what your name in the CC field means. It means you knew." Madeline looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not remorse exactly, but something in its vicinity. Something that might have been the beginning of what remorse feels like before it's been fully formed. "I didn't know how far it went," Madeline said. "You knew far enough." "Charlotte, why are you here, Madeline?" Charlotte's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "What is it that you want from this conversation?" Madeline sat back very slightly. Her hands were on the table, and Charlotte could see that they weren't entirely steady. "I want to know what you're going to do." "The findings are already submitted to the board." "Your name being in those findings—" "My name isn't in the findings," Charlotte said. "Yours is, in Exhibit 48. Madeline went still. "I included it," Charlotte said, "because it was part of the factual record, and the factual record is not mine to edit." She held her cousin's gaze. "What happens with that exhibit is a legal determination that will be made by people who are not me." Madeline looked at her with something that Charlotte recognized after a moment as the specific bewilderment of someone who had spent years operating in an environment where personal loyalties and personal grievances were the primary currency and could not entirely comprehend a person for whom they weren't. "You have every reason to burn me," Madeline said. "You know that." "I'm not burning you," Charlotte said. "I'm doing my job. Those are different things." She picked up her water glass. "If your name wasn't in those emails, it wouldn't be in the exhibit file." "It is, so it is." Madeline was quiet for a moment. "Ethan is going to lose everything." "Ethan made choices. What those choices cost him is a consequence, not a punishment." Charlotte set the glass down. "I didn't design this outcome, Madeline. He did." Something in Madeline's expression cracked. Not dramatically, just a small fracture. The kind that happens when a person has been holding a constructed thing together and runs out of the energy to maintain it. "He told me you'd come after us. When he found out about the investigation, he said you were doing it because of the wedding." Charlotte looked at her cousin for a long moment. "Is that what you believed?" Madeline didn't answer immediately. "I didn't know what to believe." "Yes, you did," Charlotte said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "You've known me your whole life." That landed. She could see it land. The small flinch, the quick movement of Madeline's eyes away and back. Charlotte felt nothing triumphant about it. She felt tired and clear-eyed and very ready for this conversation to be finished. "I have to go back to work," Charlotte said. She put $20 on the table for the water. "If you receive a formal legal inquiry related to the investigation, call an attorney before you respond to anything. That's the only advice I'm able to give you." She stood up. Madeline looked up at her from the chair with an expression Charlotte would think about later, not in the way she had expected to think about things connected to Madeline, not with anger or satisfaction, but with something more complicated and harder to name. "I'm sorry," Madeline said, very quietly, almost not a sentence, almost just an exhalation. Charlotte looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said, and left. The night outside was cold and clear, the city doing what Chicago does in autumn, asserting itself, making itself felt. The wind off the lake cutting through whatever you were wearing and reminding you that the environment here did not accommodate softness. Charlotte walked 2 blocks before she got into a cab and sat in the back with her hands in her lap and looked at the passing lights. She was not angry. She had expected to be angry. She had been braced for the particular white-hot quality of anger that comes from looking directly at a betrayal's full architecture. But what she actually felt was something more arid than that. A dryness, like a room with all the windows open in winter, the emotion present but stripped of moisture, clean in a way that wasn't comfortable but was at least manageable. She texted Reeves, "Check Exhibit 48 documentation one more time tonight. I want it airtight." His reply came back in 4 minutes. "Already did. It's solid. Go home." She almost did. Instead, she ended up back at the office at 8:15 because she had thought of one additional cross-reference she wanted to verify. And she was in the elevator going up when the elevator stopped on the 32nd floor and the doors opened and Ethan Mercer was standing in the corridor. She had not seen him since the wedding, not once in the months between then and now. He was thinner than she remembered, not dramatically, but the particular thinning that happens to men under sustained stress, the way the face becomes more structural and less inhabited. He was wearing a suit that was good, but not as good as the suits he had worn at the height of his Meridian period, which told her that the financial consequences had already begun. He had been going to the elevator. He had not expected her to be in it. They looked at each other. The elevator doors began to close. Charlotte put her hand out to stop them and stepped into the corridor. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was layered in a way she hadn't seen on his face before. Anger underneath, but above it, something she needed a moment to identify. She identified it. Shame. Not remorse. Shame. The distinction mattered, and she understood it. Remorse was about what you did to someone else. Shame was about what it meant about you. "I came to talk to Moretti," Ethan said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort of the control. "He's not available." "I know. His assistant told me." He looked at Charlotte. "I've been told he won't take my calls." "That's probably accurate." "Charlotte." He said her name with something in it she hadn't heard in a long time and didn't want to examine now. "I need you to understand that what happened with Meridian—" "I understand what happened with Meridian," she said. "I'm the one who documented it. It wasn't about you." "I know that, Ethan." "I mean—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in the gesture she remembered from 4 years of watching him manage anxiety with his hands. "I didn't set out to—" "I know," she said again. He looked at her. He seemed unsettled by her steadiness, which she found interesting. He had expected something from her. Anger, possibly, or some form of emotional amplitude that would give him something to respond to. Her flatness had no handles for him to grip. "What happens now?" he said. Not quite a question. "Outside counsel will make a criminal referral recommendation within the week," Charlotte said. "Based on that, there may be an investigation by external authorities. I don't control that timeline or that process." His face did something complicated. Criminal. The fraud statute thresholds were exceeded by a significant margin. "Charlotte." His voice broke on her name, just slightly, just at the edge. "I have a family now." She looked at him. She thought about Madeline's hands on the table at the Langham, not entirely steady. She thought about the $4.3 million. She thought about the employees who had worked in these companies for 3 years, watching things go wrong in ways they couldn't name. "I know," she said. "That's something you should have thought about before." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was the face of a man standing at the bottom of a hole he had dug himself, looking up, finally understanding both the depth of it and the dimensions of his own role in digging it. "I left," he said, "because I was afraid of you." She hadn't expected that. She kept her face still. "What?" "I left because—" He stopped. He looked at the floor and then back up at her. And there was something raw in it that she believed, which made it worse and better simultaneously. "Because you were better at everything than I was, and you made it look effortless, and I couldn't—" He exhaled. "I couldn't figure out how to be who I wanted to be standing next to someone who was already who they were." Charlotte stood in the corridor of the 32nd floor of the Moretti building, with the elevator doors closed behind her and her exhibit folder in her hands, and looked at the man she had spent 4 years building, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not warm, not forgiving, not the return of anything she had once felt, but something more structural. Like a door she had been pushing against for a long time had simply opened, and the room behind it was emptier than she had expected, and smaller, and not frightening at all. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 4 years," she said. He didn't answer. "Go home, Ethan," she said. "Get a lawyer, a good one." She walked past him down the corridor. She did not look back. She was in the conference room at 8:30, verifying the cross-reference, when her phone rang. Reeves. "We have a problem," he said. She closed the document on her screen. "Tell me." Marcus submitted his written response, 22 pages. His attorney is good. I mean, genuinely good. The methodology challenge is more sophisticated than I expected. A pause. He's arguing that 3 of the core transfer chain exhibits were obtained through access that was unauthorized under the partition permissions error. He's saying we accessed a server we weren't granted legitimate access to. Charlotte was very still. The partition access was added by mistake. We received it. We didn't request it illegitimately. I know that. You know that. His attorney is arguing that regardless of how the access was granted, the underlying authorization was never properly established, which means the evidence is potentially tainted. Another pause. Rao has called an emergency follow-up board meeting for tomorrow morning. He's proposing that exhibits derived from the partition server be set aside pending a legal ruling. Charlotte looked at the window. The city. The darkness. "Which exhibits are derived from the partition server?" she said. She already knew, but she needed to say it out loud. The Henderson-Callaway thread, the Marcus-forwarded email, and the Mercer-Hale communication with the CC field. Exhibit 48. The 3 exhibits that formed the connective tissue of the entire scheme. The ones that showed not just the individual transactions, but the coordination between them, the intentionality, the architecture. Without them, she had financial irregularities that were serious but potentially attributable to poor management rather than deliberate fraud. With them, she had a conspiracy. If those 3 exhibits are set aside, she said, the criminal referral threshold becomes significantly harder to meet, Reeves said, and Marcus's attorneys will argue that without the referral, the board has insufficient grounds for the terminations. Charlotte sat in the conference room at 8:47 in the evening with the city spread out below her and the folder in her hands, and understood that she had 36 hours to keep $4.3 million worth of documented fraud from being administratively buried by a 22-page legal brief written by a very good attorney on behalf of a man who absolutely knew what he had done. She opened her laptop. "Reeves," she said. "Yeah. I need you back here in an hour." "I'll be there in 45 minutes, he said, and hung up. Charlotte looked at the screen. Then she pulled up the partition server access log, the one that showed exactly when the permissions had been added, by whom, from which terminal, with what authorization credentials. And she began to read it with the specific attention of someone looking for the thing that would change everything, the detail that was there if you were willing to look at it long enough and carefully enough, and without flinching. She found it on the 4th page of the log. The permissions error had not been an accident. The access had been added deliberately, from Marcus Hale's own credentials, at 11:43 p.m. on the night that Charlotte had stayed late and found the first Henderson-Callaway email. Not to give Charlotte access, to give it to someone else, someone whose name appeared in the authorization field, someone who had then been supposed to remove specific files from the partition before Charlotte could reach them. The removal had not been completed. The person had added the permissions to the wrong account. They had added them to Charlotte's. She stared at the screen. Marcus had tried to tamper with the evidence, had accessed the partition himself with the intention of removing or altering what was there, had made a mistake in the execution, and in making that mistake, had handed Charlotte not just the evidence she needed, but evidence of the attempt to destroy it. She pulled up a new document. She began to type. Her hands were not shaking. They had not shaken once through any of this, and they were not going to start now, because she was 34 years old, and she had spent 4 years being useful to people who treated her usefulness like a natural resource rather than a choice. And she was done building things for other people to put their names on. And what she was typing right now was going to end this. Not because she needed it to end for her own sake, but because the $4.3 million was real, and the employees were real, and the corruption was real, and the evidence was in her hands, and she was the only person in the building right now who both had it and was willing to use it. She typed until Reeves arrived at 9:31, and when he walked in and saw her face, he stopped in the doorway and said, "What did you find?" And she turned the laptop toward him and watched his expression move through surprise, and then through something that was almost satisfaction, and she said, "Read page 4 of the access log." And while he read it, she stood up and walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the glass the way she had in this room, weeks ago, briefly, just feeling the cold, just orienting herself in the physical world for a moment before she had to go back to the document. "This is tampering," Reeves said. "Yes." "This changes the authorization question entirely." "Yes." If he accessed that server himself to remove evidence, then the question of whether Charlotte Ashford was authorized to see what was on that server is irrelevant, she said, because the person who created the question of authorization is the same person who tried to destroy what was there. Reeves set the laptop down. He looked at her. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "You present this first." "I present this first," Charlotte said. She turned back to the window. Below her, 47 floors down, the city moved with its usual relentless indifference, cabs and pedestrians, and the particular orange light of street lamps on wet pavement, the whole grinding, ordinary machinery of a city that did not care about any of this and would continue exactly as it was, regardless of what happened in this building. She found that comforting. She wasn't sure why. "Reeves," she said. "Yeah. In the morning, I need you to do one thing before we go into that room." "What?" She turned around. "I need you to pull the criminal referral draft and add the tampering evidence as a separate count." She looked at him steadily. "Because this isn't just about the fraud anymore." Reeves held her gaze for a long moment. "It never really was just about the fraud, was it?" "No," Charlotte said, "but from the beginning, it was always about the evidence." She sat back down. She had 6 hours until the board meeting, and every one of them was going to be necessary, and she was not going to waste a single minute of them on anything that did not belong in the 32 pages that the folder was going to contain by morning. She opened the document. She kept writing. The 32nd page was finished at 3:14 in the morning. Charlotte saved the document, printed 2 copies, placed them in separate folders, and sat back in her chair for exactly 90 seconds. She was not resting. She was doing the thing she had learned to do after long, sustained effort. A brief, complete stillness, like a reset, before the next thing. Reeves had fallen asleep in the chair across from her sometime after 1 o'clock with his reading glasses still on and a highlighter in his hand. She looked at him for a moment. He was 61 years old, and he had spent the last 6 hours helping her build something that would either hold or it wouldn't. And he had done it without complaint and without drama, and she found that she was genuinely grateful in a way that she didn't have language for at 3 in the morning. She let him sleep another 40 minutes. Then she put her hand on his shoulder. He came awake immediately, the way former prosecutors apparently do. "What time is it?" 3:55. He sat up, took off his glasses, rubbed his face, put them back on. Looked at the folder she placed in front of him. "This the final version?" "Yes." He opened it, went to page 32, read the tampering section. His jaw moved once. "This is good," he said. Not enthusiastically, just accurately, the way a craftsman assesses a joint that has been fitted correctly. "It needs to be more than good," Charlotte said. "It is more than good." He closed the folder. The access log is unambiguous. Hale's credentials, his terminal, his timestamp. The intended recipient of the permissions is documented. The incomplete file deletion is documented. He looked at her. "This doesn't just save the 3 exhibits. It reframes every argument his attorney made in the response brief. He built his entire methodology challenge on the premise that the partition access was an unauthorized error. If that access was the result of his own tampering attempt, his own brief becomes evidence against him." Charlotte nodded. She already knew this. She had already thought it through every way it could be thought through. "Get some sleep," Reeves said. 2 hours. I'll stay with the documents." "I'm fine," Charlotte. He said her name with the particular flatness of someone who was not going to argue, but also was not going to pretend. You have to walk into that room in 5 hours and be the sharpest person there. 2 hours of sleep is worth more to you right now than any additional preparation. She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew it. She went to the small couch in the corner of the conference room. She had noticed it her first week and had never once used it. And she lay down with her jacket over her, and she closed her eyes, and she was asleep in 4 minutes. She dreamed about the wedding, not with the emotional weight the actual wedding had carried, but in the flattened way that significant things sometimes appear in dreams. The flowers she had arranged, the seating chart she had designed, the grass stain on her ankle that she hadn't noticed until later, Ethan at the altar with that expression of satisfaction, Madeline in the entrance, perfume and borrowed confidence, herself at the top of the stone steps in the cold night air, a black card warming in her grip. She woke at 5:48 without an alarm. Sat up. The conference room was quiet. Reeves was at the table with coffee he had found somewhere, reading through the document one more time. She went to the bathroom, washed her face with cold water, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The face looking back at her was tired in ways that showed. The particular tiredness that isn't just one night, but several weeks of accumulated pressure wearing through the surface. She looked older than she had at the wedding, and she did not find this disturbing. She found it, in some way she couldn't entirely articulate, accurate. She dried her face. She went back to the conference room. Priya arrived at 6:15 with a garment bag. "I stopped at your apartment," she said. "Your neighbor let me in. I hope that's okay." Charlotte looked at her. She had given Priya her spare key 2 weeks ago for a document emergency and had forgotten about it entirely. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with more force than the words carried. She changed in the bathroom. Dark blazer, the kind that was serious without performing seriousness. She looked at herself again in the mirror. Better. Not polished. She didn't have the equipment for polish this morning, but precise, which was what the situation required. The board members began arriving at 8:30. Charlotte was already in the room. She had arranged the seating differently from the day before. The documents pre-placed at each seat, open to the access log section, page 4 marked with a tab. She wanted them reading it before the meeting was formally called to order, wanted the information in their hands and in their minds before anyone had the opportunity to frame it for them. Marcus Hale arrived at 8:47. He was accompanied by his attorney, a woman named Sandra Voss, whom Charlotte had researched at 2 in the morning and whose reputation in corporate litigation was, as Reeves had said, genuinely formidable. Voss was in her 50s, silver-haired, with the demeanor of someone who had spent decades in adversarial rooms and had developed a comprehensive patience with difficulty. Voss looked at the document placed at Marcus's seat. She picked it up, read the tab-marked page. Her expression did not change, but something in the quality of her stillness shifted. Very slightly, the adjustment of someone who has walked into a room and found the terrain different from what they prepared for. She leaned toward Marcus and said something Charlotte couldn't hear. Marcus looked at the page. Charlotte watched the color leave his face with the gradual deliberateness of water draining. Damien arrived at 8:59. He sat at his position at the far end of the table and looked at Charlotte once, a single, brief look that she had learned to read correctly by now, and then looked at the document in front of him and opened it. Carla Simmons called the meeting to order at 9 o'clock exactly. "We're reconvening at the request of Board Member Rao to address questions raised in the respondent's written submission," she said. "Ms. Ashford, I understand you have additional materials." "I do," Charlotte said. She stood. "Yesterday's session addressed the financial findings. This morning I need to address a development that occurred after yesterday's meeting concluded and that materially changes the legal landscape of this inquiry." She looked at the room. "Page 4 of the supplemental document placed at your seats, the access log for the partition server." She waited while the room read. She watched Rao's face as he read. She watched him go back to the top and read it again. Voss was already on her feet. "Ms. Ashford, the log shows," Charlotte continued, "that the partition server access was added to my account at 11:43 p.m. on November 7th. The authorization credentials belong to Marcus Hale. The intended recipient account is identified in Field 7 of the log as a service account belonging to an individual named Craig Denton. who is employed as a server administrator. She paused. Mr. Denton's access to the partition would have allowed him to remove or modify files. The access was added to my account in error. This means that the access Mr. Hale's submitted brief characterizes as an unauthorized error resulting in my inadvertent access to privileged materials was, in fact, an attempt by Mr. Hale to access and alter those materials himself. The room was very quiet. This constitutes evidence tampering, Charlotte said. Under Illinois statute and under federal standards, if the underlying fraud is prosecuted federally, which, based on the interstate scope of the vendor entities, is likely. She set her copy of the document on the table. The methodology challenge in Mr. Hale's submitted response is built entirely on the premise that the partition access was an innocent error. The access log demonstrates that it was not innocent. It was an attempt to destroy evidence, executed by the same individual who generated the evidence. Voss said, "I'd like to request a recess." "Granted," said Carla Simmons, and then immediately, 15 minutes. In the 15 minutes of recess, 3 things happened. Voss pulled Marcus into the corridor, and the conversation that took place there was not audible through the boardroom door, but its emotional content was visible in the set of both their bodies when they returned. Voss contained and recalibrated. Marcus with the particular quality of a man who has just been told something he didn't want to hear and has not yet decided whether to accept it. Rao came to Charlotte's side of the table and stood beside her and said, quietly, looking at the document rather than at her, "The partition log. This was found last night." "At approximately 8:50 p.m., Charlotte said, "and you rebuilt the supplemental around it." "Yes." Rao was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man. She had assessed this correctly from the beginning, and his caution had read, at various points in the investigation, as obstruction or as cowardice. But looking at him now, she thought it was neither. It was the caution of someone who understood that being wrong was costly and who moved slowly to avoid it. "The authorization question," he said, "is answered by the log," Charlotte said. "The person challenging the legitimacy of the access created the access for the purpose of destroying what was there. Any court will read that the same way." Rao nodded once. He went back to his seat. The third thing that happened during the recess was that Damien crossed the room to where Charlotte was standing and stopped beside her, close enough that she could speak at a normal volume and not be heard at the other end of the table. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood beside her and looked at the document spread across the table. "You found this last night," he said, 8:50 p.m. After working since 5 in the morning. After working since 6 in the morning. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she had not seen there before. Not the controlled consideration she had come to know, not the deliberate patience. Something that had less management in it. "Are you all right?" he said. It was such a simple question. She almost didn't know what to do with it. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm tired," she said, "and I need to finish this. After I finish this, I'll answer the question properly." Something moved in his expression. Not a smile. Something quieter. "All right," he said, and went back to his seat. The meeting reconvened. Voss did not withdraw the methodological challenge formally, but she did not press it. She asked 4 questions about the access log's chain of custody, all of which Charlotte answered with documentation. She asked 1 question about the independence of the log's forensic verification, which Reeves answered from his seat at the side of the room with the name and credentials of the independent IT forensics firm that had verified the log's authenticity at 6:30 that morning. Voss wrote something on her legal pad. She did not ask further questions. The vote on the suspension recommendations, which had been 5-1 with 1 abstention the day before, was 7-0 this morning. Rao voted in favor. The abstaining board member voted in favor. Foster voted in favor. For the second time, Charlotte noticed this. For the second time, she filed it away. Marcus Hale was escorted from the building by 2 members of the security team at 11:15. He walked between them with his chin level and his jaw set, and he did not look at Charlotte as he passed the boardroom door. She did not watch him go. She was already gathering the exhibit files for transfer to outside legal custody. Paul Greer submitted his resignation in writing at noon. sent to Carla Simmons and copied to Damien, and its language was so carefully pre-lawyered that it read more like a legal brief than a letter, which told Charlotte everything she needed to know about how long his attorney had been preparing it. James Henderson did not resign. His attorney contacted Reeves at 1:47 p.m. and opened a conversation about cooperation. Reeves relayed this to Charlotte without editorial comment, which was its own form of editorial comment. She called the outside counsel who would be handling the criminal referral. She was on the phone for 40 minutes. When she hung up, she sat very still for a moment, and then she wrote in the case notes. Referral formalized. Scope: fraud, conspiracy, evidence tampering. Referred parties: Hale, Greer, Henderson, and Calloway, independent. Mercer and Calloway to be addressed separately based on cooperation assessments. She looked at Ethan's name in that sentence for a long moment. Then she closed the document, saved it, and transferred it to the secure case server. It was 3:20 in the afternoon. She was done. Not completely. There would be follow-up, documentation, testimony preparation, audit oversight, months of administrative consequence management. But the thing that had needed doing was done, and it had been done correctly. And the people who had built a private economy of corruption inside a legitimate one for 3 years had been removed from the positions that made it possible. She sat in the empty conference room and felt the particular quality of an ending, not triumphant, not relieved, something more neutral and more honest than either. The room looked different when it was over. The document grids on the walls, the printed ledger pages, the timeline charts, they were still there. But they had the quality of a structure after the scaffolding has done its job, functional rather than charged. Priya knocked on the open door. Going home, Priya said. She had her coat on and her bag over her shoulder and the expression of someone who had operated significantly above her pay grade for several weeks and had done it without complaint and was now, finally, allowing herself to look tired. Thank you, Charlotte said. Genuinely. What you found with the server partition. I came in early, Priya said. That's all. That's enough, Charlotte said. That's more than enough. Priya looked at her for a moment with the directness that Charlotte had identified on her first day as the quality she liked most. Are you okay? Charlotte thought about what Damien had said that morning, not what I asked. Getting there, she said. Go home. Priya left. Charlotte sat for another few minutes. Then she began taking the document grids off the walls, carefully, rolling them and placing them in the storage tubes she'd bought in week 2, and she dismantled the room with the same methodical attention she had used to build it. She was finishing when Damien appeared in the doorway. He looked at the room. The walls bare now, the table cleared, the folders stacked for transfer. He looked at Charlotte, who was rolling the last timeline chart with both hands, the way you roll a poster, with the particular care of someone who has learned not to crease things that might be needed later. Done, he said. The room is. She secured the roll with a rubber band. The rest follows over the next few months. He came in and sat on the edge of the table, which was not something she had ever seen him do, and which told her something about his current state that his face was not quite communicating. He looked tired. Not the surface tiredness of a long day, but the deeper tiredness that comes from having held something carefully for a long time. Calloway, he said. The referral includes him. His location will be a matter for the relevant authorities. Damien nodded. He was quiet for a moment. I brought him in 12 years ago, he said. He was good at his job and I trusted his judgment more than I should have. He looked at the stack of folders on the table. I missed it. The structure was designed to be missed, Charlotte said. That's generous. It's accurate. She set the rolled chart in the storage tube and capped it. The Kellerman fraud was also designed to be missed. I found it because I was looking for something else and happened to see the pattern. Sometimes the people who find these things find them by accident as much as by skill. She looked at him. What matters is what you do when you see it. Damien looked at her. The quality of his attention had the weight she had come to associate with him at moments when he was being most precisely himself. What do you want to do now? He said. Not now as in this afternoon, the larger now. Charlotte set the storage tube down. She thought about the question seriously because it deserved seriousness. I want to sleep for approximately 16 hours, she said. And then I want to come back and start on the operational restructuring we've been deferring because of the investigation. She paused. The real estate division needs a new operational head. The vendor review process needs to be redesigned from the ground up. The board governance structure has 3 gaps that made this possible, and they need to be closed. Damien looked at her for a moment. That wasn't what I meant. She knew that. She had answered the question she was capable of answering honestly right now and deflected the one she wasn't. She thought he probably understood this. I know, she said. He stood up from the table. He picked up one of the storage tubes and held it. There's something I've been carrying for a while, he said. Not preamble, just directly, the way he said most things. I want you to know it, and I want you to know it now while we're both standing in a room that smells like printer toner and 3 weeks of no natural light, because I don't want to tell you on a rooftop or over dinner or somewhere that makes it seem like I've been managing the timing for effect. Charlotte stood still. She looked at him. 4 years ago, he said, when I read the Kellerman report. I told you I read it and that the executives were removed. That's true. He looked at the tube in his hands. What I didn't tell you is that I read your name in that report, and I asked someone who worked for me to find out who you were. He paused. Not for business reasons. The room was very quiet. I watched your career from a distance because I didn't have a legitimate reason to approach you, and approaching you without one wasn't something I was willing to do. He set the tube down. He looked at her directly. When I saw you at the Whitmore estate, it was not a coincidence. I was there because a business associate was a guest, and I had accepted the invitation 3 months earlier, and then I saw your name on the event staff list. A pause. I'm telling you this because you should know all the facts. You've spent 7 weeks working with incomplete information in this building, and I'm not willing to let you walk out of here with incomplete information about me. Charlotte stood in the conference room at the end of the longest day of her professional life and looked at Damien Moretti, who was standing 6 feet away from her with his jacket on and his hands at his sides and an expression that had none of its usual management in it, just the thing itself, the actual thing, which was more complicated and less composed than anything she had seen on his face before. She thought about what it meant. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything, without rushing it toward a conclusion. You were at the estate because of me, she said. Yes. And the text. The invitation to meet outside. Yes. You could have introduced yourself differently. Earlier. Yes, he said. I could have. I didn't, because I didn't know what you were walking into that evening, and I didn't think showing up in your life and telling you I'd been watching your career for 4 years would... He stopped, almost smiled. It seemed more reasonable to wait until you needed a business card. Charlotte looked at him. She felt something that was complicated in a way she didn't want to simplify yet. Why tell me now, she said. Because you've been in this building for 2 months working for me, he said, and I'm not comfortable with the information asymmetry. That, she thought, was the most accurate thing he had ever said to her. She picked up a storage tube from the table. She held it and looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back at him. I don't know what I feel about that, she said. I'm going to need time to think about it. Take it, he said. I might conclude that it's... She paused. Strange, or complicated in ways I'm not ready for. You might, he said. I'm not asking for a conclusion. I'm asking for you to have the information. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He had the quality she had identified in the very first night on those stone steps. The capacity to make a space available without filling it. To say a thing and then be still and let her think. All right, she said finally. I have the information. He nodded once. She picked up the last storage tube. He picked up the stack of folders, and they carried them out of the conference room together, without further words, because there was nothing further that needed to be said tonight, and they both understood that. The criminal proceedings moved with the particular slowness of large legal machinery that is being operated carefully rather than quickly, which Charlotte had expected and prepared for. Marcus Hale's attorney negotiated for 6 weeks before the charges were formally filed. Henderson cooperated early, and his cooperation produced 3 additional pieces of documentation that tightened the conspiracy count in ways that Reeves described, in his characteristically understated way, as very helpful. Robert Calloway was located in Portugal 3 months after the referral. His extradition was a separate proceeding that Charlotte was not involved in beyond providing documentation, which she did thoroughly and without commentary. Ethan's case was handled separately, as the referral had indicated. The scope of his involvement, knowing vendor for fraudulent payments, placed him in a different category from the principal conspirators, and his attorney leveraged this distinction aggressively. Charlotte was called to give a witness statement to the outside investigation team. She gave it in a conference room at Reeves's firm, without Damien present, without any Moretti Group representation in the room, and she answered every question with the same precision and the same emotional register she had used throughout, factual, specific, unembellished. The investigating attorney asked her, near the end, "Ms. Ashford, were you personally acquainted with Mr. Mercer prior to this investigation?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "In what capacity?" "He was my fiancé until approximately 8 months before the investigation began." The attorney made a note. "Does that relationship affect your testimony today?" Charlotte looked at him. "No," she said. The attorney looked at her for a moment, then he made another note and moved on. Ethan received a conditional agreement, financial penalties, restitution, a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director in any regulated industry. His company, which had been thinning visibly for months before the formal proceedings even began, dissolved in the 6th month of the process. Charlotte read about it in a business filing notification she received in the ordinary course of business administration. She sat with that for a moment. Not long. Then she filed it and kept working. The operational restructuring of the Moretti Group's legitimate holdings took 11 months. Charlotte led it the way she led everything, methodically, in sequence, without drama. She brought in a new real estate division head, a woman named Torres who had rebuilt 2 distressed commercial portfolios in the previous decade, and who came with a reputation for being difficult to manage and excellent at her job. Charlotte found her easy to work with. She suspected this was because neither of them had any patience for performance at the expense of substance. The vendor review process was redesigned with 4 independent oversight layers and mandatory disclosure requirements for any vendor relationship involving an existing employee, board member, or their immediate connections. She drafted the policy herself, had it reviewed by 3 separate legal teams, and presented it to the board with the supporting documentation for each provision. Carla Simmons approved it without amendment. Rao asked 2 questions, both good ones, and approved it after Charlotte's answers. The board governance gaps, 3 structural vulnerabilities that had allowed the corruption to operate without triggering oversight mechanisms, were addressed through bylaw amendments that required a qualified majority to effect. This took 4 months of preparation and 2 board sessions. Charlotte drafted the amendment language, worked through Reeves on the legal review, and presented it with the particular thoroughness that she had learned, in this building, was the price of being taken seriously by people who had initial reasons to doubt her. The amendments passed. 7-0. She did not celebrate. She went back to her office and made notes on the next item on the restructuring list, because that was how work got done, and she had never been someone who stopped moving long enough to congratulate herself on the previous thing. She was in her office at 6:40 on a Thursday in March, 10 months into the restructuring, when Damien knocked on her open door. She looked up. He had his coat on, which meant he had been somewhere or was going somewhere. He didn't wear the coat inside the building as a rule. "Come upstairs," he said. "There's something I want to show you." She followed him to the elevator and up to the 32nd floor and through his office, which surprised her. She had been in his office many times, but they had always met there, never passed through it, and out through a door she had not previously noticed at the back, which opened onto a stairwell and up 1 flight and out onto the roof. The rooftop was not a designed space, not a terrace with furniture and ambient lighting, nothing like that. It was functional, HVAC equipment and access structures and the particular gravel and membrane surface of a working roof. But the view from it was something else entirely. 48 floors above Michigan Avenue, the city spread in every direction with the lake to the east catching the last light of the day, in a way that was, objectively, extraordinary. Charlotte stood at the edge. There was a railing, chest-height, solid, and looked at it. She had grown up in Chicago. She had lived here her whole life. She knew this city in the way you know a place you've never had to think about knowing, in your body, in your sense of direction, in the way the light looks in October, and the particular sound the wind makes in the gaps between buildings. But she had never seen it from exactly this angle before, and the angle changed something, the way a different angle always does. Damien stood beside her. He was looking out at the same thing she was looking at. "I come up here sometimes," he said, "when I need to think." "About what?" "Whatever requires it," he paused. "Tonight I wanted to show it to you." Charlotte looked at the city. The lake was turning from silver to pewter in the fading light. Below them, 48 floors down, the street moved with its ordinary machinery, small and indifferent. "The restructuring," Damien said. "It's almost done. 3 items left on the list, 2 months, maybe 6 weeks if the logistics contract review moves quickly. And after that," she looked at the lake, "I've been thinking about that." "Tell me." She had been thinking about it for several months, in the way she thought about things she wasn't ready to decide yet, turning it over in odd moments, in the early morning before she was fully awake, in the cab rides home. What came after? What she wanted from after. "I don't want to stop," she said. "This work, the kind of work this has been." She paused, finding the right words. "Before I came here, I spent 4 years being excellent inside someone else's structure, solving someone else's problems, making someone else's decisions look better than they were." She looked at the city below. "I don't want to go back to that." "You don't have to." "I know." She turned to look at him. "I want to build something, not inherit it, not manage it. Build it." She held his gaze. "I want to establish an independent practice, financial forensics and governance design, taking on clients who need the kind of work I've done here." She paused. "I've been drafting a business plan for about 4 months. Damien looked at her. "You've been drafting a business plan," he said, "in the early mornings, before 6. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, not quite, but something that had warmth in it. "And the Moretti Group. I'd want to propose a retained relationship," she said. "Ongoing governance oversight, quarterly audit support, board advisory as needed, a formal contracted arrangement with defined scope and independent terms." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to be inside the structure. I want to be adjacent to it." He looked at her for a long moment. The city hummed below them. The lake had gone from pewter to the particular deep gray blue of dusk. "That's a good plan," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. She saw it move through his expression and not quite arrive at his mouth. "The business plan. I'd want to read it." "When it's finished," she said, "I'll show you." They stood in silence for a moment. The silence had the quality of a thing that has been earned rather than simply arrived at. "Charlotte." He said her name differently than he usually said it, less professional, more direct. She looked at him. "I've been patient," he said, deliberately and genuinely. "I'm not going to press what I said in the conference room. I meant it then, and I mean it now, and I don't need you to do anything with it on my timeline." He looked at the city. "But I want you to know that patience and indifference are not the same thing." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the black card warming in her hand on the stone steps. She thought about what he had said in the emptied conference room, the information asymmetry, the fact of him watching her career for 4 years, the decision to tell her in a room that smelled like printer toner rather than somewhere managed for effect. She thought about the difference between being seen and being watched. She had spent a long time, before this year, being watched by people who wanted something from what they observed. Ethan had watched her capabilities the way someone watches a resource. The difference with Damien was one she had identified early and had been careful about, because early identification was not the same as certainty. But she was not at early anymore. She was 10 months in. She had worked beside this man through the most demanding professional period of her life, and she had never once felt diminished by his presence, never felt the particular pressure that came from men who wanted women to be good at things but not better at them. She had been completely herself in this building, including in the ways that were not easy or pleasant, and he had not once tried to manage that into something more comfortable for him. That was not a small thing. She knew now exactly how rare it was. "I know the difference," she said, "between patience and indifference." He looked at her. I've been thinking, she said carefully, about what I said in the conference room, that I needed time. She looked at the lake, which had gone nearly dark now, just a shade deeper than the sky. I've had time. Damien was very still beside her. I'm not someone who makes decisions under pressure, she said, or sentiment, or loneliness, or gratitude, which I want to be specific about because I do feel genuinely grateful, and I needed to be sure I could distinguish it from other things. She turned to look at him directly. I can distinguish it. And, he said, very quietly. And I think, she said, that there is something here that I'd like to find out more about, in a way that's honest and doesn't rush and doesn't perform anything it doesn't actually feel. He looked at her for a moment. His face had the quality she had come to associate with him at his most genuine. Not the controlled consideration of a professional interaction, but the simpler, less managed face of a person who is actually present. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. She turned back to the city. He stood beside her. Below them, Chicago did what it always did. Persistent, unself-conscious, generating its ordinary noise without any awareness of the 48 floors above it, or the 2 people at the top of it, or anything that had happened in the building beneath them over the past 10 months. She thought about the wedding, the dress she had ironed and the flowers she had arranged and the seating chart she had designed and the 4 years and the loan and the pitch decks and the cold night air and the stone steps and the black card. She thought about Patricia Marsh's voice in the alcove. She's like a golden retriever. You throw her a task and she fetches it. She thought about Ethan at the bottom of a hole he had dug himself, looking up. I left because I was afraid of you. She thought about Madeline at the Langham, hands not entirely steady. I'm sorry. Very quietly. Almost just an exhalation. She thought about 32 pages and 48 exhibits and a server access log on page 4 that had changed everything, and the 6 hours she and Reeves had spent building something that held under pressure because it was built on what was actually true. She thought about the woman who had ironed that dress with the quiet efficiency she applied to everything, who had measured her value and how much she could carry, who had been useful and capable and excellent, and had spent 4 years turning all of it towards someone else's future. That woman was still her. She hadn't left her behind, and she hadn't transcended her, and she hadn't healed in the clean, simple way that stories sometimes suggest healing happens. She still had the 4 years in her. She still carried the particular scar tissue that forms when you love someone who is using you, and you don't see it until it's over. But she was also here, on this roof, having built something with her own hands from evidence she had found herself, having stood in a room full of people who had reasons to dismiss her and made them read 32 pages until they couldn't, having taken the favor she'd been given in the dark and turned it into a structure that would outlast everyone who had tried to dismantle it. The city below her shimmered in the way that cities do at dusk, when the transition between the light that comes from the sky and the light that comes from human beings has equalized, and for a moment the whole thing looked as if it were lit from within. She had seen this before, many times in 20 years of living here, but she let herself look at it now without moving on. Damien didn't speak. He didn't fill the silence. He stood beside her with his hands on the railing and his shoulders 6 inches from hers, and his face turned toward the same thing she was looking at. And the city did its ordinary work below them, and the lake held the last of the light, and Charlotte Ashford stood on a rooftop in the city where she had spent her whole life and felt, for the first time in as long as she could accurately remember, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be, not where circumstance had placed her, not where usefulness had carried her, not where someone else's need had pointed her, where she had walked by her own feet to her own decision, with her own name on it. The wind off the lake was cold and specific. She felt it against her face and didn't move away from it. Below her, the lights of Chicago went on and on into the dark, burning with the particular persistence of a city that has no interest in endings, only in the next thing, and the long, ordinary continuation of everything that comes after the part of the story that people remember. She stayed until she was ready to go. Then she went.